I think one of the most immediately noticeable things about a fighting game is its aesthetics. Whether it's pixel art based, 2.5D, 3D, or specially stylized, a fighting game's art style is always going to be the first thing that stands out to me when looking at a fighting game. Obviously, graphics are supposed to hook players, but this is an intrinsic part of fighting games particularly. The better a fighting game looked back in the arcades, the more likely you were to stop and look at the attract mode, and the more likely you were to put a quarter in. This has led to some pretty memorable art styles in the genre. Arc System Works in particular have made a name for themselves having a really distinctive 2D sprite-based style, and then again in 3D from Guilty Gear XR onwards. There's older games with completely wacky aesthetics like Wacko Wacko 7, and a favorite of mine, Slap Happy Rhythm Busters. But one particularly notable style I've always found fascinating is the SD or super deformed art style. This is when characters are depicted smaller, usually with oversized heads and smaller limbs in an attempt to make them look cute and kinda funny. This isn't something exclusive to fighting games or even the gaming medium as a whole. There's a whole lot of media out there that indulges in this, usually to appeal to children, though sometimes it's because the creatives just wanted a change of pace, or it might have even been done out of necessity to sidestep a technological hurdle. But naturally, it's its implementation in fighting games that I want to highlight today. Fighting games have dipped their toes into this a few times, with some really obvious examples and some you may not have heard of. For this video, I'm going to primarily be highlighting a few fighting games from either long-running fighting game series, or at least made up of characters from said series. Though I'm limiting this to fighting games, there is one extra instance I'll be mentioning. It's not specifically a fighting game, but it's a bonus mode in the fighting game that implements this style. As always with these videos, if there's an example you think I overlooked, let me know in the comments. I always like learning about new things. That said, let's head off to the races. Let's begin with one of the first notable examples of this style in the genre, Virtua Fighter Kids. This one is basically a super deformed take on Virtua Fighter 2, featuring that game's cast and stages along with slightly faster gameplay and a bigger emphasis on combos. Unlike Virtua Fighter 2, which was developed on Sega's Model 2 arcade hardware, Virtua Fighter Kids was developed on the lesser-known Sega Titan Video hardware instead, commonly abbreviated as STV. The STV board largely shared its architecture with the Sega Saturn hardware, having a slightly higher RAM pool to work with in addition to using cartridges instead of CDs, meaning that games developed for it could expect near, if not 100% arcade-perfect ports to Sega Saturn. This wasn't anything new for Sega. They'd previously developed arcade boards based on their console hardware with the System E and System C boards, based on the Master System and Genesis respectively, and went on to develop the Naomi arcade board based on the Dreamcast. While it seems kind of weird for Sega AM2 to go from creating one of the biggest fighting games of all time with Virtua Fighter 2 to doing a chibi take on the same game, there was actual merit to this game's development, and it informs the choice of art style as well. Sega AM2 used this game as something of a testbed for a facial expression technology they were working on for the also in development Virtua Fighter 3. Giving the characters large heads allowed them to more easily convey a wider range of facial expressions on the tech they were working with at the time. So this is an interesting example of game development dictating the art style choice here. Gameplay wise, it's basically VF2 but a little faster. Characters have slightly larger hurt boxes than usual to account for each character's stubbier limbs, and this ends up making the game a bit more combo-centric than most other games in the series at this point. So much so that the Saturn port of the game even features a create a combo mode to mess around with. The stages and music are all from VF2, but are adjusted to fit the game style instead. The music in particular is a highlight. Pretty much all of the stage themes are cutesy remixes of VF2 stage themes. Virtua Fighter Kids kinda got blasted back in the day for ultimately just being a lesser VF2, and I kinda get that. At the same time though, the aesthetics, and specifically those facial expressions, do a lot of the heavy lifting for my enjoyment of the game. Just seeing their faces when they get hit with a strong attack or get knocked out is hilarious in a Looney Tunes kind of way. Speaking of hilarity, I'm a big fan of the game's CG intro sequence, showing off the Virtua Fighter cast alongside their kids' counterparts, usually acknowledging them in earnest or with just complete and utter bewilderment like Sarah here. It also bears mentioning that there's a simplified automated control scheme available for the game to lower the barrier of entry for newcomers, which is a pretty cool consideration that the series didn't really regularly make. Funnily enough, this is the only Virtua Fighter game with actual character endings. They're more on the humorous side, think Street Fighter EX or Tekken's endings, but this is still legitimately more characterization than we'd ever see from the mainline numbered games. I'm a big fan of Sarah's ending in particular. The initial Japanese release of this game is similar to Fighting Vipers in that there was a cross-promotional tie-in with a beverage, this time being Java Tea. Instead of getting a full-on character in the game representing the brand like Pepsi Man in Fighting Vipers, the loading screens instead depict Jackie drinking a can of it, and more hilariously, also replaces Shun's alcohol with a can of the tea. The game was re-released in Japan without the branding, and the Western versions of this game would be based on this re-release. Between the lukewarm reception of the game and it being more of a tech demo experiment to begin with, it's no surprise that Sega didn't really revisit this concept again, though the character models wouldn't quite go to waste. The kids cast would be obtainable capsule toy prizes in the first two Shenmue games, and perhaps more significantly, the kids versions of Akira and Sarah would be unlockable characters in the Sega Saturn crossover fighter, Fighters Megamix. Unfortunately, they're among the worst characters in the game. As it turns out, having stubby limbs doesn't quite work well in the game where everyone else has normal proportions. Still though, I'm glad they're in the game in the first place, and they add to the game's earnest weirdness more than they subtract from it. If you have a Saturn and have the means to play imports on it, I suggest the Japanese version, as there is no real language barrier to the game and it goes for pennies online. Even the North American release goes for less than a lot of other US Saturn releases, even if it's more than what the Japanese release goes for. And hey, since we're talking about fighters on the Saturn, Super Gem Fighter Minimix, commonly referred to as Pocket Fighter, is probably the first game that comes to mind when the subject of fighting games with this specific aesthetic comes up. Interestingly enough, this is the second Capcom game to use this aesthetic, with the style and a lot of the sprites being lifted from Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo. Itself, Capcom's take on the puzzle game boom spearheaded by the popularity of Puyo Puyo 2 in Japan. Pocket Fighter is a 3-button game, with attacks separated into punch, kick, and special. Seems like very little, but each character has quite a few motion inputs and command normals assigned to their punch and kick buttons. The game's standout mechanic is its gem system. There's 3 meters that fill up when you collect the color-coded gems that appear when you or your opponent takes damage. As you fill up the meter, they can level up twice for a total of 3 levels, with each level granting its respective special move a new property. Take Chun-Li's regular level 1 fireball. Nothing too crazy. Bring it to level 2 and it gets larger and it does more than 1 hit. Get it to level 3 though, and she throws a hilariously sized fireball at the opponent. You can also use your special button to guard crush opponents with a special charge attack, and the direction you hold while doing this dictates which color gems will come flying out. And honestly, every attack in this game is hilarious. Everything from special moves, super combos, to even regular normals and command normals are pretty funny. Take Morrigan's usual standing affairs from Darkstalkers. In, say, Vampire Savior, she transforms her wings into spears and then stabs them forward. In Pocket Fighter, she does the same, only every pointy bit instead has a bunch of shoes on them. The game also has a canned combo system somewhat inspired by Star Gladiator's plasma combo system. Basically, there are canned combos done by pressing punch and kick in certain sequences. The neat thing about these is that they're denoted by the characters doing cosplay, usually as another Capcom character, just adding to the game's charm. I think my personal favorite is between Felicia turning into Mega Man and firing his Mega Buster, and Chun-Li dressing up as Jill Valentine and using a bunch of her weaponry from Resident Evil 1. So much of this game is just oozing with Capcom charm. You can tell the developers just had one hell of a time putting this game together. Even the logo is awesome. If you look closely, each character is represented somewhere. Ken's peace sign in the P, Chun-Li's cuffs as the O, Felicia's paw prints in the K, Sakura's uniform in the first T, Morrigan's bats in the F, Mei Ling is the I, Ryu's fist makes the G, Tessa's hat in the second T, Zangief's scar and trunks in the R, and Ibuki shuriken on the bottom. Talk about being put together with love. Even though this is largely a Darkstalkers and Street Fighter crossover, I do have to applaud the inclusion of Ibuki and Tessa here. Street Fighter 3 wasn't all that popular around this time, but they still had the presence of mind to include one of the coolest newcomers from New Generation here. And I think 99% of people that know of Tessa probably know her because of this game instead of her home series. Dan and Akuma are unlockable characters as well, hiding in plain sight. Each character has their own little story, with an opening cutscene, a pre-final boss cutscene, and an ending, and these scenarios are just as silly as the game itself, thankfully. For example, Felicia wants to transition from singing to movies and tracks down Ken since he's cool with Fei Long, who's in the movie industry. Morrigan sees a picture of Chun-Li and makes it her life's mission to run down on her and remind her just how much better looking she herself is. Genuinely hilarious stuff. Obviously, this game doesn't see as much competitive play as, say, Vampire Savior or the Street Fighter Alphas, but it's a legitimately fun game with some actual depth to it. Thankfully, this is one of the few games that Capcom has reasonably kept in circulation over time. It was ported to the Sega Saturn and PlayStation, and while your first instinct is to probably think that the Saturn version is better, I should note that A, you'd be correct, but B, not by much, since Pocket Fighter is probably one of the few 2D Capcom fighter ports where the gap between the Saturn and PS1 isn't huge like it usually is. The Saturn version has more animation, especially with the RAM card, but the PS1 version holds up shockingly well. Both versions also feature an exclusive mode, Running Battle. It's sort of like a survival-like mode where you fight continuously on one moving stage, surviving as many opponents as you can, with characters from Capcom arcade and console games alike in the background, notably Ryu and Nina from Breath of Fire 3, among others. And I don't know if you've noticed, but we like Breath of Fire 3 on this channel. The stages in general are honestly some of the most charming, cameo-filled stages to ever grace a Capcom fighting game, and I get a dumb smile on my face every time I see them. I might look okay on the outside, but inside, I just want to be as happy as Bison is sledding through the snow stage. One often overlooked addition to the home ports is a new super move for Dan, the Shin Koryuken, done with a half circle back, half circle forward, and the special button. Though it's available on PS1, the Saturn version has an additional tornado visual effect at the end of the move that isn't present on PS1. The PS1 port also has a mode not seen in any other version of the game, Edit Fighter. Here, you can customize a computer-controlled character with certain abilities and obtain items and treasures by fighting other computer opponents. Notably, your starting character can be determined by a personality quiz Tessa gives you, and the items you earn can increase your chosen fighter's power and give them abilities like better gem drops. It's pretty neat. The game also received a port to the PlayStation 2 as a part of the Street Fighter Alpha anthology. This one's basically a port of the arcade version and features all of the animations cut from the previous console ports completely intact, though being an arcade port, it's lacking the bonus modes from the PS1 and Saturn ports. Interestingly enough, Dan's console exclusive Shin Koryuken is present in this version and can even be toggled on and off via dip switches as well. It even features the visual effect that was missing from the PS1 version. The game is available on PS3 as a downloadable PS1 classic, and the arcade ROM is available as a game that can be purchased in Capcom Arcade Stadium 2nd. The most convenient way to play these days is via the Capcom Fighting Collection, which has rollback netcode as well as a training mode, and hey, Puzzle Fighter's in there too. Talk about a bargain. That said, there's one other version of the game as well, but it's interesting enough that I want to talk about it in a bit more detail. The WonderSwan is probably not a platform most people outside of Japan are familiar with. Designed by Gunpei Yokoi, the man behind the Game Boy and the driving force behind the earliest entries in the Metroid and Kid Icarus series, the WonderSwan was Bandai's entry into the dedicated portable console market. While it and its follow-up, the WonderSwan Color, never got released outside of Japan, it had a pretty interesting library of games with surprisingly decent third-party support from Namco, Capcom, and Squaresoft. That last one being kind of a big deal, since they had notably been absent from Nintendo platforms from the mid-90s onwards. One of the games Capcom provided was a port of Pocket Fighter, and I was ready for this to be a disaster of a game. So imagine my shock that in spite of the obvious cutbacks that had to be made here, what's left is actually a surprisingly kick-ass handheld version of the game. The full cast, including Dan and Nakuma, are available here, and all of the characters still have their story scenarios and dialogue as well, which is nice. I'd have thought they'd maybe cut that. Since Pocket Fighter was a 4-button fighter, there's no control-related cutbacks here, though I imagine actually playing this on the WonderSwan itself is probably a pain. The biggest thing here, of course, is the gems, which can no longer be denoted with colors now, so the decision was made to smartly alter the shapes of the gems instead to make it easier to tell which gem affects what. The game is a little slower and obviously doesn't animate as well as its arcade and console older siblings, but honestly, it plays really well for what it is. You'd be surprised how many combos from the arcade version work here. Stages got the biggest graphical cutback, and understandably so. Pocket Fighter has some of the most detailed Capcom stages ever, and there was no way they were going to be able to pull that off in a 16-bit handheld. There's also collectible cards in-game based on the roster that can be unlocked as well, which you get by beating arcade mode. Also, they actually took the time out to include Dan Shin Koryukin from the console ports as well, so hey, moveset parody is always nice. The soundtrack is basically comprised of lower fidelity renditions of the arcade soundtrack, and while obviously not as great as the original OST, these are some pretty good arrangements overall. The WonderSwan version does have one exclusive mode though, Card Battle Mode. This takes the core gameplay and I shit you not, turns it into a turn-based card battle game. You select your character, and when the fight starts, you have to choose a card out of your hand. The numbers on the cards represent attack and defense strength, and the idea is to play a card with higher value than your opponent so you can damage them. You can stack these attack cards for a combo in certain circumstances, and also end them with a special move for extra damage if you like. You also have guard cards, evasion cards, and health regen cards as well, which adds a layer, albeit kind of a shallow one, to the general strategy. The battles are kind of slow, and it gets repetitive after a while, but it's a really novel mode that makes for a sensible addition to a handheld port of a fighting game. Also worth noting, this version of the game actually has a cameo in the Street Fighter Alpha OVA. It's the game Sakura is playing on her WonderSwan in the hospital. I wonder how that works if she's in the game too. Overall, I was pleasantly surprised with how good this version of the game turned out to be. It plays well, animates about as well as it could, and features most of the charm that makes Pocket Fighter, well, Pocket Fighter. I do wonder how this game would have looked as a WonderSwan Color title though. Even though the charm is still there in black and white, can't help but daydream about what a color version of this port would have looked like. Speaking of WonderSwan Color,
here comes a daredevil!
Not to be outdone by Capcom, Arc System Works and Sammy released a handheld version of their flagship fighting game on the WonderSwan Color with Guilty Gear Petit. This is essentially a handheld, pared-down version of Guilty Gear X with a chibi art style. And as dire as that might sound, this one's another game that goes surprisingly hard. Fighting is done primarily with the B and A buttons, making it a 2-button fighter. Punches and kicks are done with one button, and slash is mapped to the other, while pressing both A and B and forward is the universal motion for dust attacks. It works surprisingly well, and a surprising amount of the arcade original's gameplay manages to shine through here. There's even instant kills. The roster is admittedly small. You get Saw, Kai, Mei, Milia, Potemkin, and Jim as an unlockable character, but the game's most notable inclusion is the completely new character made specifically for this game, Fanny. Fanny has something of a nurse theme and carries around a big ass syringe, and if your first thought is, she kinda reminds me of Faust, That's probably because she's implied in-game to have a connection to him somehow. She even has some of his moves. One aesthetic detail I love that they carried over from Missing Link and X is the personalized font for each character name on the select screen. I'm a huge fan of when games do this. Marvel vs. Capcom 1's another good example, because it just injects that much more personality into the characters in the game itself. You get a story introduction for each character, as well as dialogue for the final arcade mode fights as well. There's also a training mode with a surprising amount of options for a handheld fighting game at the turn of the century. Character movesets are represented pretty well overall. Saul has all of his usual tricks like Riot Stomp and Volcanic Viper, as does Kai with Vapor Thrust and such. It's shockingly pretty faithful. It's a little bare bones, but what's there is good, and there's definitely room for potential growth. And the devs must have realized that too, because later the same year, they'd release Guilty Gear Petit 2, which is more or less an expanded version of the first game. The roster adds Faust, Zato, Chip, Axel, Johnny, and Testament as an unlockable character, basically including everyone in X outside of Baiken, Dizzy, and Venom. There's a new password mode added, and this apparently has some connectivity with Guilty Gear X Plus on PS2. Essentially, there's passwords that you can find in Petit 2 that can be entered in Plus to unlock certain things a bit earlier there. My understanding is that there's no unlock exclusive to these passwords, so it's just a nice little bonus in Plus for people that engaged with Petit 2. Of course, you can't talk about Guilty Gear without talking about the music, and I wanted to wait until Petit 2 to bring it up since it's the more complete of the two games. Like with Pocket Fighter, most of the game's tracks are chiptune renditions of the arcade soundtrack, and while they aren't scratches on the originals, I kind of appreciate the attempt. What surprised me the most is that they even bothered including the rival themes for certain matchups. No Mercy for Saul and Kai, Fatal Duel for mirror matches, they're all there for the applicable characters, and that's neat. Have a listen. Another interesting inclusion to me is a group of secret characters that can be unlocked through the game's survival mode. Every so often, you'll encounter a special variation of a character in that mode, and beating them unlocks them for play anywhere in the game. Thing is, these versions of the characters are specifically based on their Guilty Gear 1 incarnations, altering their movement options and abilities to reflect that game. It even extends to instant kills, which becomes their original ones from Missing Link. Guilty Gear Plus, which released about 2 months after this game, also features the same deal, so it's clear this was likely conceived for Plus and thrown in Petit 2 as a bonus, since Plus serves as the basic framework for Petit 2. Kai's GG1 version of Petit 2 even utilizes Robo-Kai like Plus does. Overall, this is a surprisingly cool handheld version of the first two versions of Guilty Gear X. These days, there's not really any point to playing Petit 1 over 2, since 2 literally includes all of 1's content and more. I'd say you should definitely pick up the cartridge version for the Wonder Swan color, but good luck finding Petit 2 for a reasonable price. I don't think the internet police will run down on you for emulating this. If you want to learn more about some of the wackier handheld entries in the Guilty Gear series, Guile Winquote has a fantastic video on the subject that includes these two games that I'll link in the description. And while we're on the subject of fighting game series that had to debut on the PS1, Battle Arena Toshinden is a game that, regardless of its quality, is associated with the early PS1 days as something of a quote-unquote Virtua Fighter killer. While public perception was that Sega largely fumbled the Saturn port of Virtua Fighter 1, Toshinden was flashier, functional, and managed to sway people over to PlayStation. While Sega would later regain their footing again in a big way with the honestly still impressive Saturn port of Virtua Fighter 2, Toshinden would start declining in popularity pretty much after the first game. In 1996, Sega would release Virtua Fighter Kids in the arcades, followed immediately by a Sega Saturn release. Not to be outdone, Toshinden series publisher Takara and developer Tamsoft released Battle Arena Nito Shinden for the PS1 in Japan in September of that same year. Hope y'all are ready for some Kusage, because man, this game is not great. Kind of a shame too, because Nito Shinden is a pretty great pun. It combines Nidoshin, a term roughly translating to two heads high, which is essentially the design principle behind chibi characters, into Shinden. Of the games we've covered so far, this one arguably has the funniest title. This game CG intro is something else. It starts with live action footage of the Toshinden cast, given these wacky English titles. Meltdown Lover? Flying Lunch Boy? I couldn't make this stuff up if I tried, but it's kind of silly in a charming way, I guess. At first, it seems as if they accidentally put an intro for an entirely different game on the disc, only for a cartoon mallet to come out of nowhere and boom, kids. To the game's credit, it has a series of tutorial videos that I don't quite think I've seen in this specific style before, at least on the PS1. Points for originality, I guess. The cast for this game is actually kind of interesting, in that half of the cast comes from Toshinden 1 and 2, and the other half are completely original to this game. Eiji, Ellis, and Sophia from the first two games are here, which tracks. They're probably the three most recognizable characters from the series, and Tracy returns from Toshinden 2. She has a lighter skin color in this game for whatever reason, so she looks more like Family Dollar Leona this time around. There's another Toshinden 2 character as well, but I'll talk about him later. The new characters include Rika, a schoolgirl loosely based on a line of dolls produced in real life by Takara, her friend Ryuji, the shirtless, tatted up masked dude named Baifu, and Shu, who has a cool ass long coat and can summon ghosts to attack for him. On top of being super deformed, Nito Shinden's entire aesthetic, with one obvious exception, is essentially What If Toshinden, but in school. So the vast majority of stages are either in a classroom, a room in a school, or on a playground and such. The walled backgrounds of the stages also kinda sway in an old-timey cartoony way as well, which is neat at first, but it gets weirdly disorienting the more you look at it. The game's controls are largely simplified from the main Toshinden games. You have a 360-degree attack, a low-hitting attack, 2 heavy attacks, a special move, and new to this game, a parry. It's the only form of defense you have outside of rolls in this game, but thankfully it has lenient timing. Not to say Toshinden games were dripping with polish before, but this game's kinda budget and it really shows. Characters don't even have walking animations, they just kinda sway forwards and backwards like puppets on strings. The actual fighting itself isn't really that deep. Combos are largely an imaginary concept in this game, though some moves do seem to unintentionally chain into itself. Like the main series, there's also desperation moves that can be done when your health bar is flashing, done by pressing the special and parry button at the same time, and you can use them as often as you like for however long your health bar is flashing. There's a tournament mode which basically amounts to an arcade ladder, a versus computer mode, and a 2-player head-to-head mode, and that's about it. Beat the arcade mode, watch a character's ending, and that's about it for single-player stuff. But if you beat the game on any difficulty without losing a round, you get challenged by the game's secret boss, Vermilion, who also served the same purpose in Toshinden 2, and went on to become a recurring antagonist in the series. Now, remember when I said this game mostly had a schoolyard playground aesthetic? Vermilion throws all of that out the window and pulls up with a shotgun. I don't even know how to begin unpacking that. It's like playing at the park as a kid, and then another kid shows up with a gun. Which, hey, I grew up in 1990s Harlem. It was actually like that sometimes, but still, holy shit. Beating him gives you an additional ending, and that's that for single player. Look, this isn't a good game, and I'm not going to pretend it's something that remains fun for more than a few minutes. I don't think I'd say this game shouldn't exist though. It seems like it was absolutely meant to be something of a quick cash-in, and the game being so half-baked both mechanically and visually is definitely a testament to that. But it also reminds me of how much more feasible and less expensive game development was back then. You could kind of churn a game out like this back then to fill out a release schedule and not lose tons of money on it compared to today, where even a AAA, high-budget game with a ton of love, care, and money poured into it can still underperform financially. It bears mentioning that Takara also put out a Game Boy conversion of Toshinden 1 which employs a similar chibi style that actually plays decently for what it is. Takara would also partner with developer Galbrain and SNK to make several Game Boy conversions of SNK Fighters in the same aesthetic, most of which are, again, surprisingly playable considering how fighting games on the platform usually ended up. This kind of ended up being something of a sign of things to come for SNK, as they'd employ a similar art style for their own fighters on their Neo Geo Pocket handheld. There's a lot of Neo Geo Pocket and Neo Geo Pocket Color fighting games out there with this style, and covering all of them would be one hell of an endeavor. Fortunately, Babe Ruthless has a video covering every game in the genre on the platform that I highly recommend watching and will have linked in the description. That said, of all the fighters on the platform, there's one in particular that I want to highlight, because it's the game in the library that comes the closest to approaching, if not outright matching, the manic energy of Pocket Fighter. And it's a title that shows that fighting games can always use a woman's touch. Gals Fighters is, simply put, one of the most bonkers fighting games SNK's ever made, and that's a good thing. One of the last fighters released for the Neo Geo Pocket Color, second only to The Last Blade, Gals Fighters sees the discovery of a magical talisman that can grant any wish. Naturally, a tournament is held, the Queen of Fighters, where the winner gets the talisman. The roster is made up of women from across SNK's franchises. Obviously, you have Mai from Fatal Fury, Yuri from Art of Fighting, Leona and Shermie from King of Fighters, Athena repping both Psycho Soldier and KOF, Nakaruru and Chiki from Samurai Showdown, and Akari from Last Blade. The tournament itself is being held by the mysterious Miss X, who looks familiar, but I can't quite place where I've seen her before. Like Pocket Fighter did with its Capcom cast, Gals Fighters features a more cartoony aesthetic than their other fighters, with the cast having playfully exaggerated variations of their legacy movesets. For example, Yuri's Ryoken replaces her jumping fireball with her swinging a hammer. For real. She even has a special where she summons her dad for a quick attack before he starts scolding her for a bit. All of Mai's fire-infused moves end up burning her during the recovery animations. And a lot of Athena's moves in general have her switching between most of her KOF costumes up to this point, though her default in this game is her KOF 99 design. While a lot of the sprites are reused from previous Neo Geo Pocket Color games, again, something it has in common with Pocket Fighter, there's a few new ones included as well, like more over-the-top damage sprites for the characters when they get hit. Even something as simple as running animations are just funny as hell here. Look at this Sonic-ass run cycle. Or Nakaruru's, where you can practically hear that one Hanna-Barbera cartoon running sound effect. Don't even get me started on the game's little clash mechanic, where you have to mash for a free opening, and you get that cartoony little dust cloud during the scuffle. A big part of this game is its item system. By winning matches under certain conditions against specific opponents, you can obtain items that can be equipped at the start of an arcade run that grants you buffs, or nerfs to your opponent, like starting with a full super meter. Losing a battle also means that you lose the item you have equipped though, so there's a bit of risk and reward. You can always earn the item back the same way you unlocked it though, so nothing's really lost for good. They're also important for unlocking Miss X, who only unlocks if you get every item in the game or otherwise fight 100 battles. There's two other unlockable characters, Whip and Yuki, Kyo's girlfriend, making her only playable appearance in an SNK fighter. She can even show up as a hidden opponent during the game under the right circumstances. There's also Pretty Burst, a universal mechanic done by pressing down down in both punch and kick with any character. This activates a special ability that varies by character and can either damage, buff, or nerf you or the opponent. For example, Shiki summons a snake that damages you. Mai can drain all of your meter in one shot. Yuri pulls out a drink that boosts her damage a bit. And Whip straight up curses you out, preventing you from using your meter for a short time, among others. Like most other fighters on the Neo Geo Pocket, the two main buttons respond to punch and kick, and doing a long press gives you the heavy variation of those actions. This game's actually one of the faster and more loose SNK fighters on the platform, feeling even more freeform than, say, SNK vs Capcom. When labbing stuff out in this, I'm always surprised at how many times I catch myself saying, yo, that combo works? The super moves, called Mighty Bops, are also hilarious. There are even more exaggerated takes on some classic SNK moves, though some of them get even crazier, like Leona calling an airstrike. My favorite little detail was when you KO an opponent with one. Doing so flashes images of your opponent's hopes and dreams being ripped away as they lose the fight. It's an overall incredibly fun fighting game that for the longest time seemed trapped on the Neo Geo Pocket Color, which sucked since it was definitely one of the more expensive fighters on the platform. Thankfully, SNK released the Neo Geo Pocket Color Selection Volume 1 on Switch and later Steam, which includes this game among other SNK Neo Geo Pocket Fighters. There's even a physical option on Switch if you're like me and absolutely have to own a physical copy. It's the most convenient way to play the game these days, and even if no current thumbstick compares to the greatness of the clicky micro-switched Neo Geo Pocket thumbstick, it's still good to be able to play the game. Bears mentioning that if you're playing this via the compilation on Steam and you're using a controller or Steam Deck, you can actually use Steam Input to assign the long button presses as separate buttons, meaning that you can actually play this like a traditional 4-button SNK game, and that goes for all of the fighters in the Steam collection. I'll leave a link in the description showing you how you can set that up. Being a Neo Geo Pocket Color game, it of course went ignored for years, but against all odds, the game got something of a spiritual sequel a few years back in the form of SNK Heroines, a 2v2 fighter that similarly has a cast made up of women. Unlike Gals Fighters, which is its own little bubble, SNK Heroines, despite the wacky stuff going on in it, is actually canon to the KOF timeline, officially being stated to take place between KOF 14 and 15. The game itself is alright, I guess. It's a bit divisive, and it doesn't help that the Switch port, the platform with the highest chance of capturing a new audience, was kind of hamstrung by being 30 frames per second with performance issues. Still though, kind of amazing that Gals Fighters' legacy still lives on somewhat. Before we finish up here, there's a few honorable mentions that I want to shout out here as well. I mentioned Takara's SNK ports on Game Boy already, but I want to shout out Fatal Fury 2 in particular for going all in with the style. When a character does a special move, there's even a word bubble of them saying the attack name in place of a voice clip. While this isn't a fighting game, it's a bonus mode with this specific style within a fighting game, so whatever, I'm counting it. Mortal Kombat is one in a long line of bonus modes to come from the 3D era of Mortal Kombat, this one appearing in Armageddon. It's surprisingly fun for what it is, and I wouldn't mind seeing something like this come back in the future. There's probably some people out there that prefer this to Invasions. Dragon Ball Kai Ultimate Butoden employs a semi-chibi style to account for the DS's smaller screen resolution. It's a pretty fun and content-packed fighter too, definitely worth importing. Speaking of DS, BlazBlue has a super deformed spin-off on the DSi titled BlazBlue Super Melee Brawlers Battle Royale, with BlazBlue being intentionally misspelled. This one's a simplified 3D arena fighter that's vaguely reminiscent of Power Stone. Unfortunately, you can't really play this outside of emulation or having a homebrew DSi or 3DS since the DSi shop doesn't exist anymore. And that's going to do it for this video. As always, thanks for watching, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next video.